Disclaimer, this podcast is not in any way affiliated with Universal, DreamWorks, or Big Idea Entertainment. All opinions discussed belong to the person sharing their views and may not reflect on our personal beliefs. And with that, enjoy the show. Welcome to the very first episode of the What's the Big Idea podcast. The podcast is designed to interview former associates of Big Idea Productions to talk about life before, during, and after VeggieTales. In my very first interview, I'm talking to Robert G. Lee, a writer who penned some classic veggie stories, such as Gideon Tuba Warrior, The Ballad of Little Joe, Sherlock Holmes, and many more. You'll hear about his upbringing, his inspirations for writing, and many of his interesting stories right here on this podcast. So now, here is Robert G. Lee.
Here I am with one of the most talented, clean screenwriters, writers, actors, directors, maybe even producers of Christian business and Hollywood. But we also have the hilarious, absolutely fantastic Mr. Robert G. Lee. Now, of course, before I even ask you any sort of business questions or anything like that, how are you doing on this fine Thursday morning/afternoon?
Today is a great day. I'm going to have an interview with you and work on some comedy for a show tomorrow night. Then I'm going to the beach with my wife. She needs to kind of get the energy from the water. She's had a hard week, so it'll be a good day for me. So I'm absolutely fine. Thank you for asking.
All right. I mean, it is just a pleasure to be talking with you, Mr. G. Lee, and hopefully just through getting the right amount of luck, I can start talking with other people related to Big Idea, because just letting you know, I am an absolutely huge VeggieTales fan and have been ever since I was a child. But, you know, before we talk about the VeggieTales stuff and anything relating to your illustrious Hollywood career, there's always a beginning. And we have to talk about the very start of the man known as Robert G. Lee that is speaking to me as of this moment. So, Mr. G. Lee, tell us about your childhood. Tell us about your upbringing. What are some fun facts to know about you?
Well, and it's one of those strange things you can't even talk about anymore. But I have a distinct memory. I was 5 years old. I saw Bill Cosby on television, funniest guy I ever saw in my life. And I told my parents, that's what I want to be. And then my parents told me I could not be black, so I had to go for the comedy thing. But my whole childhood was listening to Bill Cosby records and memorizing them. And people talk about race relations and you've got to be inclusive. I said, no, you don't understand. I was a white kid from Indiana who listened to a guy tell stories about Philadelphia. He was black, I was white. It didn't matter. We were joined with humanity. And then, of course, all my ideals were shattered. My fandom is just left in the dust as we found out who he really was, and it hurt me like nothing else has. But my childhood was literally listening to Bill Cosby records, and then I expanded into other comedy. And you can almost grade and look at my life. I'm a guy from Indiana. I had no idea how to break into show business, so I listened to first it was Bill Cosby, then it was George Carlin, then I started watching old movies, and I acquainted myself with all the greats from Charlie Chaplin to Buster Keaton, because I couldn't ask any girls out because I was scared of them. So I went to movie theaters by myself, and there was an old movie theater that showed old-timey movies. I fell in love with that. And then Monty Python and Woody Allen, and slowly but surely my comedy ideals started to form and what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And so I've told this story to different people, but everybody knows what they're supposed to do at a certain point in their life. And mine came fifth grade. And that sounds very strange. And maybe it was too early to really know, but we were given an assignment. We watched this movie of this hunter with a gun, and he's going out to shoot a deer. And then he sees the deer and it has a doe with it, and it's drinking by the water, and he has a change of heart and he leaves. And everyone writes an essay about this. Well, I wrote a comedy routine. And I made my teacher cry. She was laughing so hard. But what struck me at the end wasn't that, okay, I killed, but it was that nobody else in the class wrote a comedy routine. And that's when I realized at fifth grade, my brain didn't work the way everybody else's brain worked. And I realized I was different. And that memory never left me. I always thought of that. It's like, oh, well, of course you don't think like I do, because we're made differently. So spent my life stumbling forward, trying to figure out how to use this comedic sensibility that I have to, one, use it for fun and profit. So childhood was fine, raised back in Indiana, loving parents. Everybody else has these great testimonies of how they were saved from being an embryo in the streets of Calcutta. And I had a very loving childhood. I'm sure there's dysfunction in it. We won't go into it, but warm, nice family, and just eventually realized I could leave Indiana and go out to film school and go to Hollywood and try and make my living at it. So I can answer any question you want, but that's sort of a general thumbnail of my childhood.
All right. Just still talking on the subject of childhood, I'm just going to ask a couple of like really rapid fire questions. What was your favorite movie?
They're doing a movie series at our church this weekend, and they said next week it's going to be the greatest movie ever made. And I immediately said, Flubber? And no, it wasn't Flubber. It was The Passion of the Christ. But I love those. When I was a kid, it was Disney movies. I mean, Blackbeard's Ghost, but I love Toby Tyler. These are way before your time. But Swiss Family Robinson had to be number one. It was just classic, wonderful, a great adventure. So yeah, all those Disney clean movies. But then I loved Hang 'em High with Clint Eastwood. I saw that one when I was 10 or 11, and then Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid when I was 12, and that opened my eyes to, wow, this is what real movie making's like. So those are the movies from the early days.
That's awesome. Were you ever a fan of animated movies? And if you were, what were some of your favorites?
First one out of the box was Sword in the Stone. That was just a great fantasy picture because the boy Ward got to go around with Merlin and change into a squirrel and a fish. It was just fantastic. That just sparked my imagination. So I loved all the Disney animated. My sister hated cartoons. She hated animated films, and I loved them. So 101 Dalmatians, I mean, eventually it was Pinocchio and Snow White and all that. But in that era, 60s, it was The Wonderful World of Disney every Sunday night on TV. And the animated films that Disney was doing, Jungle Book was great. They were lesser quality ones. Didn't like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty that much, but loved Sword in the Stone and most of the Disney films. Yes, I've been a huge animation film my whole life and love superheroes and comics. So Superman, Batman. I was definitely a DC guy because Marvel didn't really get going until late 60s. I didn't like that as much.
So it's really kind of crazy how much, just based off the information of your early childhood, just kind of foreshadows your career, because you've definitely worked with shows that were on the live action front, like George Lopez, if I'm not mistaken. But then you also worked on some animation stuff, which, goes VeggieTales and that sort of thing. So it's kind of crazy how the stuff that interested you, you were like, well, eventually I grew up, went into the business, and then I basically did what I wanted, as a kid. So that's a really crazy ambition to turn out so well.
Everyone's life is a huge blender, and your childhood is all these ingredients are being thrown in, and then you hit blend, and usually right around high school, college, a little bit after, you kind of take all those things that were inputted into you, and you figure out a way to make a living with it. I've been very fortunate that the world has allowed me to make a living doing what I love, and I've been reminded of that. One time I was back at a reunion. I was talking to some friends, and they talked about, well, what surprised you after high school? And mine was, I didn't think it was going to be this hard. I really thought I was going to hit one career and just, hit easy street and I'd be fine. But it's always a struggle to reinvent and figure out where you're going and what you're doing. And my friend said, he took me aside and said, Bob, you're doing what you love to do. Everyone is envious of your career. And that's when I stopped and went, oh, yeah, I'm just kind of pitching a bitch here, aren't I? That was a good readjustment. But yes, I'm so fortunate that just using the skill and the craft of comedy, I have been able to parlay it into warming up television shows, writing on television shows, writing a movie, and all the stuff I did for VeggieTales. So it is this huge conglomeration of things that came out of my passions as a kid. So I cannot deny that everything I did worked toward where I am today. So yes, I am well aware of how your life does influence what you end up doing.
Just some other questions, but what was your favorite music band growing up, whether it was Christian or not Christian?
Music band, always the Beatles. They were on Ed Sullivan. I saw them back in '64. I was a Beatle fan from the get-go. Not so much a Rolling Stone. They were more blues, and I like the Beatles melodies. And then as I got a little bit older, fell in love with The Who and sort of Led Zeppelin, but definitely the 70s, the rock and roll bands. And I was the geek who stayed in his room and read the liner notes. And I can remember I'd be out with different people and I'd say, oh, that's Eric Gale on guitar. And they go, what are you talking about? I go, that's Eric Gale on guitar. He played backup on this, and this. They go, how do you know that? I go, because I had no life. I just listened to music in my bedroom.
That's crazy, because for me, I love to just do as much research. If I get hooked on something, it's a never ending pool of just trying to figure out what inspired this. So it's crazy that in your youth you kind of reflected that curiosity of trying to go behind the scenes and delve deeper into things. For someone like me, that just makes me even more interested, that I'm talking to somebody who has a lot of knowledge that I would like to know about certain things that you worked on. Would you say that you had any favorite Christian musicians or anything like that? Did you grow up with a family that was like, it's only Christian music and you had to kind of sneak in the Beatles or some non-Christian bands?
My mom, she was a choir director at our church, and she had no knowledge of any kind of hip music at all. So I was able to listen to whatever I wanted to. I had my own phonograph record player in my room, and so I got my own albums. And she did not complain. Matter of fact, the one album that she wanted me to take back was the my first Bill Cosby record, because I think I was in fourth grade when I got it. And there's a routine he does with the Lone Ranger, and every time they go into town, Tonto gets beat up. And at one point, Lone Ranger says, "Tonto go into town," and Tonto says, "You go to hell, Kimosabe." And my mom heard that word. Wait a minute, he said hell, and she was going to throw that record away. And I had to beg her not to throw that record away. So that was the only time I had a conflict with my mom. Otherwise, she was the kind that says, look, whatever you love to do, you go ahead and do it. My dad didn't understand. He was in insurance. He was the business guy, but my mom was the creative type, and she knew that creativity could be limited. So no, my parents were definitely not of the ilk, you can only listen to this, only listen to that. And as far as Christian music, it really didn't start until I got into college, and I really didn't turn the corner to become a Christian and have a God view until I hit college. And then I fell in love with Larry Norman. You may or may not know him, but he launched Randy Stonehill. It was still more of that rock and roll, but he came out with Only Visiting This Planet, and it was genius. And then a lot of people followed suit. There were the saccharine Christian groups, and I just didn't like them at all. My roommate in college did, and I was like, okay, fine, I'll live with that. And then eventually I loved a couple Amy Grant, a couple Michael W. Smith, but then Michael Card. Charlie Peacock was my favorite one. Man, he was back in the, I think, 80s, and he did Lie Down on the Grass. That was my favorite album for a long time. So I would go back and forth. A lot of avant-garde, almost new wave Christian artists. I like that. I was never one of the saccharine Evie. I like Second Chapter of Acts. I love Matthew Ward's voice, but I wasn't a huge fan. I was a moderate fan. So my feet were firmly planted in the rock and roll sensibilities more than Christian praise music.
It's funny that you mentioned the name Matthew Ward, because if I'm not mistaken, I do believe he got involvement in an episode of VeggieTales. Actually, one of the episodes that you wrote.
That's great.
He sang Gated Community with popular Christian artist Matthew West, and he was there. I believe he did the harmony part of that song, so it's kind of a crazy coincidence if I'm getting the facts. If I'm getting the facts right.
I'll tell you who my favorite is right now. It's like, and people make fun of me. It's like I go to church and it's like I just listen to this praise music and it just beats me down. It's like, because I argue with it theologically. I go, well, that's not correct. Well, that you're diminishing God there, and so I can't get out of myself. But I love Kirk Franklin. I will go to. I'm the lone white guy in a Kurt Franklin concert because I love it so much. Because otherwise, I'm just way too Presbyterian and stuck in my, I just say indeed at everything, and it's hard to get something to move me. But gospel music, for some reason, resonates in my soul. So yeah, rock and roll and gospel, those are my two favorites.
With most of the childhood stuff out of the way, we're going to be transitioning into the early days of college and then your transition into actually entering in the industry. Let's just start off with like a couple of fun little college adventures, if you would care to indulge me a bit.
Well, that's fine. I had a comedy partner. I was too afraid to go on stage by myself, but I knew I wanted to do stand-up comedy. Started my own radio comedy show. It was a half-hour comedy show, basically modeled after Monty Python. And what I realized years later was that I was learning how to run like a sitcom room where the writers would come in, they'd pitch stories, we'd work them out, then we'd go record it a couple days later. And when I went, then eventually landed in the sitcom world, I realized, oh, I've been doing this since college. And that didn't strike me for quite a while. But it was a public radio station back in Ohio called WOUB. I went to Ohio University. What was great about that college was they let you get your hands dirty and work on all the equipment. And other colleges, you have to wait till grad school. But this school said, yeah, you want to do a radio show? Go ahead and do it. As a matter of fact, I blackmailed them into letting me do an album at the end of my days there. So 4 years, and we wanted to record some of the sketches we'd done. The show was called Foxpaw, and it was my last 2 years of college. And Nancy Cartwright was one of the original members. She went on to become the voice of Bart Simpson out in Hollywood. That's an interesting story because she became a Scientologist, and eventually we lost touch with each other. But just doing a radio show every single week, I came up with my own theory of comedy. It's like, all right, it's got to be clean, it's got to be timeless, it's got to be funny. I realized if we ever repeated anything and there was something funny in the fall and I was making fun of something regional, well, it's not going to play as well when they put it on the radio 6 months to a year later. So I started to develop my theories of comedy. And then as I became a stand-up, I realized, why write something today like political humor that's going to offend half the audience and then be dead in another couple months? So I always tried to do something that's clean, timeless, and funny, and I've kept that ever since college. So that was the radio show and called Foxpaw. Then I started doing stand-up comedy with a partner, and the two of us went around and we would do. I mean, we open up in bars and we perform in front of groups and any place. It was a school of hard knocks. That's what my friend always said. His name was Kevin. We were mostly Bob and Kevin. And we went around the college and just did whatever we could do. And I can remember one bass player coming up and goes, "Man, you got a lot of guts. I can hide behind my bass, but you're naked out there, buddy." It took me through college until I finally got enough guts to get up on stage by myself. And even then, I was still hiding behind characters. I was too shy and insecure to go out and do it on my own. But finally, I got over that and started doing stand-up on my own in my late 20s and 30s. In college, everything was great. I remember I met my wife at college, and we were in a comedy class together, how to write comedy. That's how cool Ohio University was. They had that class. And I sat in the back, and she was in the front. And every week I would move one seat closer to her until the end when I asked her out on a date. So college was a wonderful time to experiment, fail, rip off Monty Python mercilessly, deal with conflicts with people, and still manage to get a radio show out every single week, a half hour of original comedy. So yeah, it was a great time for me. It really was. I loved it.
Wow, so it already seemed like just right off the gate, you hit it swinging. I mean, you're already training for your future stand-up career, learning the ins and outs of writing techniques, writing jokes, and preparing for the future work that would come your way when you would be on the stand-up shows and sitcoms and that sort of thing. So that's really amazing. Again, it's just constant foreshadowing of future events. That just mesmerizes me to no end. Now here comes the big question. What did you do to finally get your foot in the door to Hollywood? Because, some people be trying to get into that industry their entire lives. Did you know somebody beforehand, or did you just have a miraculous event that happened where you finally were able to get the door? Like, how was entering the industry for the first time? How did that go?
It really all started with doing warm up before Hollywood sitcoms. And for those who don't understand what that is, you just don't go out and start off for 5 minutes and get the audience going and leave. A warm-up comic is there for the full 2, 3, 4, 5 hour recording, and they're the ones that keep the audience entertained and laughing at the same level at the end of the show as they did at the start of the show. And then if it's a cold audience, you got to get them up to the right level. That started when a friend of mine named Ray Combs, and he came from Ohio and I was from Indiana, we worked together, and he moved out to California, and he lied his way into a show. And he came over to my house and said, okay, he pretended he was his own agent. And he called up a TV show, and he was touting this young comic that he knew by the name of Ray Combs. And he got a gig. And so he came over to me, and we worked on his act and came up with every possible audience participation game we can come up with. And it launched him. He started working. He eventually ended up on Golden Girls. And what happened was every time he would do a show, I would go to the show with him, and we would work on it. How can I make this better? What can we do? And eventually somebody offered him an acting job on another show, so he left the Golden Girls. So I got to come in and be the substitute warm-up on Golden Girls. And when I did that, then I wrote everybody else. And so I got on Designing Women. And then I got on Perfect Strangers. And once you do that, you start to meet the producers. I was there on Family Matters when they introduced Steve Urkel. And so I became the comic warm-up comic for all what were called Miller Boyette shows. And that was Step by Step, The Hogan Family, Perfect Strangers, all of those that you might see on TV Land at some point. And then I was able to get into Wings, and Wings was just a great show. From that, I did the pilot of Frasier, and from that, I did, and these producers would go to different shows. And so that was one way that I got my foot in the door. And from there, I said, I want to write on these shows. So I was able to join the writing room on different shows. And eventually that petered out because I realized that I didn't fit. And that was a hard realization. Now, while I'm doing that, I'm also doing stand-up clubs. This is back in the 90s. These things were working, but they weren't taking off. And especially in the stand-up clubs, I just didn't fit. I didn't fit there. I didn't fit in the Hollywood sitcom rooms. And it was because I had a different sensibility. And I do have that, I'm married, I've got kids, and I have a faith. And that doesn't play in the comedy clubs, and it didn't play in the writing room. It did some of the the family shows like Step by Step and Perfect Strangers, but those shows went out of vogue in the late mid 90s and they died, and it was just all Seinfeld and Wings and those kind of shows. So those are the shows I didn't fit in as well. I was scratching my head and just trying to, that was when the transition came. So it's not hard to get your foot in the door in Hollywood. It's hard to find your niche. And once you find your niche, it's hard to stay there. And I got to tell you, a lot of people write a pilot and then I'll go out there and I'll pitch it to Hollywood. No, you don't understand how the business works. So doing the TV warm up was great for me because I got to watch the best of the best. I got to watch Ted Danson and Julie Louis-Dreyfus and just see some great talent, and to watch the producers and watch the directors as they do the show. And it really gave me a great education on, oh, this is how you do comedy. These are the nuts and bolts, again, behind the scenes. And I use that in my own career. But and at this point, I almost say I'm at the tail end of it, because Norman Lear was the last producer I worked with. He just turned 100, and most of the producers I've worked with have retired. So I'm moving on now to just straight stand-up comedy. And I had this little curve in the middle where I did Veggie Tales and became the drama director at my church. So I have had a lot of ups and downs. But your original question is, how do you break into Hollywood? It's persistence and it's luck, also being able to fit. And if you don't have the same sensibility as the people that you're working with, you better find something else pretty quick.
Here you are, you're a stand-up comedian who's also very vocal about his faith. It makes me question that whether you were in the writing room for some of these sitcoms, were there any times where you presented jokes and they said, no, we can't do that, it's too much in the faith realm, or it just didn't tickle their sensibility since their comedy would be a lot more darker, a little bit more edgy, more risque, that kind of thing? Did you come into a lot of moments where you had to kind of butt heads between your comic sensibilities and what the other writers and producers wanted?
Everybody's nice. There was nobody who ever came and had a direct conflict with me. There were rumblings and there were feelings, and I did hear things. One direct thing, when I was in the other room, they thought I was out of earshot and they insulted me and my faith, and everybody laughed. And so you realize there is a stigma. There is that, well, he's not really one of us, and we'll tolerate him. But nothing ever came up where I pitched a joke and they went, well, that's well. One of the most interesting things to me was Becker. I wasn't a writer on Becker. I was the warm up, but everybody knew my sensibilities. And I came up after one show and I talked to the executive producer and said, look, I really appreciate you guys, what you did tonight. You had a really good debate on God. And Becker didn't believe, his character was a doctor. He didn't believe in God, but his nurse did. And so they had debates. And they were fair, they were equal, and nobody was presented as an idiot. For the rest of the run with that show, they'd all come up and go, well, Bob, you're going to like this one. And so whenever they dealt the God card in any sitcom, they would come over and talk to me about it. So they knew who I was, and they tolerated me because they liked what I did for them, and they basically liked me as a person, but nobody fought me on one side, and nobody said, hey, I'm interested in this Christian stuff you believe in. It was just sort of, we're going to hold your beliefs at arm's length, because Hollywood's filled with people with different beliefs. It just doesn't mean you have to have them over to your house all the time. So no direct conflicts. I know I was mocked a couple times on one particular show, but yeah, you know what? That's the way it is.
I mean, I'm glad, because I honestly don't think that no matter what belief you have, that should bar you from getting any sort of experience. So it's definitely good to know that during your time there, nobody was like trying to have it out for you, or we're trying to like ruin, cancel, destroy your career. At your tail end of working on the stand-up shows and the sitcoms was when you started morphing into Veggie Tales. Now, how exactly did that come about?
I was the drama director at our church, and that sounds very strange. They don't have many of them around anymore, but it was my job to take the pastor's sermon, do a video beforehand or a video afterward, and to drive home the point. And the best example I can give is the time word stewardship came up. Well, you know, the giving campaign that they would have at every church, because they've got to make their monthly budget. Everybody hates those. They just hate them. They go, all the church wants is our money. Well, we found that humor can break down defenses. And so if you could address through humor, then people would be more relaxed when the pastor would come up. And sometimes he goes, you know, I need a setup here. I'm going to do Paul's journeys, and I want you guys to do a map and show the audience where he went and what he did, so I don't have to take time to do it during my sermon. So for 16 years, I took a group of about 30 to 40 volunteers, and we put on something every week, if not every other week. It was, again, that leadership ability that I had in college where I ran a radio show, I used those same techniques when I ran the drama department. And we had a group of writers, we had the producers, we had the actors, and I would cast it. Sometimes it was live, but most times it were video. I was editing with different editors, and it was a great experience. Now, I bring all that up to say one of the people who was working for VeggieTales at that time went to our church. One day he came up to me. He says, I think you'd really fit at VeggieTales. I said, oh, I love them. They'd come out, and I'd seen a couple of their videos, and my kids were a bit out of the VeggieTale age, but I knew what they were, and I started watching them. And so he set up a meeting for me to go in and pitch some ideas. And you may not know this, but VeggieTales had a very hard time finding writers because writers for VeggieTales split into two different camps. Either they understood scripture and they weren't funny, or they were really funny, they didn't understand scripture. So to have a Christian comedian for them was almost the unicorn that they were looking for. They didn't know how to find it. And so I went in, 7 pages of ideas. And the very first one I sold was the story of Little Joe. It was the Ballad of Little Joe, and it's the Western. Well, on page 1, I had an idea of a Western. And page 7 of my pitches, I had an idea of doing the story of Joseph. When I left that meeting, somehow they put them together and they said, you know what our favorite was? Our favorite was Joseph as a Western. And I said, yeah, that's my favorite idea too. And so I just totally lied. And that's how I got my first job at VeggieTales.
Do you remember when exactly this pitching phase happened? Like, I would imagine it probably was somewhere maybe earliest 1999, maybe to like 2001.
It was 20 years ago. So yeah, late 90s. Yeah. And the reason they were looking for outside writers is because it was the time the movie Jonah came out. Phil Vischer and Mike Nawrocki were working on the big movie. They needed to keep the pipeline going. They had to have the quarterly VeggieTales come out just to keep the money coming in because they couldn't take 2 years off just to write a movie. So that's why they brought me in. That's why they were looking for outside writers. So whenever Jonah came out, you got to back that up about 2 years. And they started, I started writing for them, and then they started making these other videos.
I know that this is like 20 years ago, so, it's completely fine if you forgot, but do you happen to still have a copy of what were the other episodes you try to pitch for them?
I have lots of notes. Again, it was 7 pages of notes, and a lot of them we made over time because they would go back after we finished that one. It's like, well, what do you want to do next? And how about this? I said, well, this is my favorite story. And then they would say, well, how would you attack that one? And that's how I got Gideon. I did that one. And, but one that came up later wasn't even the original notes, but I wanted to do a Sherlock Holmes story because it was popular and I wanted to satirize that. So we came up with Sherlock Holmes. And what was fun in doing all of these was that I know you said Kurt Henneke did all the music. The first one, like Little Joe and a couple of them, I would sing the songs to them, and then they would send them from LA over to Nashville, and Kurt Henneke would do his magic and make them great. And then when I did Sherlock Holmes, he understood who Gilbert and Sullivan was. So I just said, do this like a Gilbert and Sullivan. And I wrote the lyrics like that. And it's like that. And Kurt took that and he made the song that we did for the Sherlock Holmes in that style. So from then on, I would just write the lyrics and he would do all the music.
On a separate podcast, you mentioned the name Sean Gaffney. He was the guy who pitched the King George and the Ducky story, which was originally the David and Bathsheba story, was replaced with the Ducky, but it was supposed to take place in Israel. Did you have like any other contact with Sean Gaffney or lost contact throughout the years or anything like that?
He has been a close friend for the last 20 years. So I know Sean, know him very well. He's now working as a professor at the university in Kentucky. So I haven't seen him for probably 3 years now, but he was involved in an accident a while ago. And I had a big, long, hour-long conversation after he and his wife got out of that. So Sean Gaffney is a dear, dear friend. And I do remember the story of King David and the Ducky. And I thought Sean was brilliant in that he took the idea of lust. It's like, how do you convey the David and Bathsheba story for kids? How can we possibly do that? And he came up with the idea. It says, no, it's not about a woman. It's about lust, having something, wanting something, coveting something that you don't have. And when he came up with the rubber ducky story, it's like, all right, that's just brilliant. So that is Sean. Sean is the guy that you want to have in your room because he has this giggle. And when he giggles, you just know that you've hit it. It's like, okay, that's it. That joke's in because Sean giggled. And he was our barometer for if something was funny or not funny. And if you can get Sean to giggle, it never left the script. So Sean is great in that he's got a really good sense of story, and that's why he's a screenwriting professor in a college right now, and he's writing a story called, I don't know if he's rewritten the title or not, but it's basically the theology of story. And he's the first one I ever found it out, discovered it. Basically, that the Bible is an echo of every story you've ever seen. And I know Joseph Campbell tried the hero's journey and things like that. You know what? It all comes back to, if it does not echo the story of the Bible, it will not resonate in our own minds. And so he's got a whole course on it. He's writing a book on it, and he's finished it, and I've given notes back and forth. So yeah, Sean Gaffney is a name that I will, for the rest of my life, say I love that man. So you don't have to worry about it. Have you fallen apart or fallen away? No, he's just a great guy.
So now let's get back into stuff that you were actually writing. So Ballad of Little Joe, which I don't know if you remember this, it was released in 2003. Just a little tidbit about myself. At that time, I was 3 years old, so I was a wee lad. I remember specifically getting that as a Christmas gift from my mom in Christmas of 2003. But enough about me. We're here about you, Mr. Lee. So particularly about Ballad of Little Joe, behind the scenes, I heard that one of the producers, I believe it was David Pitts, he mentioned that there was about 4 minutes of the story that was cut. For reference, the video is 36 minutes long, so that would leave about 4 minutes of extra content that was kind of scrapped. Would you happen to recall any of the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor?
Well, now I'm mad at David Pitts. From 20 years ago, do I remember what was cut? I have to disappoint you and say no. What I do know is that you try and time it out, you write everything, and then when they animate it, some things just go longer and some things are shorter. It's like, oh, this is taking too much time. We got to find a way to cut it. And again, I come from the sitcom world where it's like, it's got to fit in 22 minutes. So we got to trim this and fix that. And how can we get from this scene to that scene without using this scene? So I can't fault them at all for doing that, because they want to keep it within a certain time limit. And cost was a very big deal to them. I will explain it this way. In Little Joe, there's a scene where they're in the big pizza parlor, and so they have to build it. They have to build an entire 3D scene. Well, that cost a lot of money. They had plains and prairies, so when we had Joseph out with his family and the sheep and all that, they could do that because they already had that model, but they didn't have the bar scene. But then later, when I got to Sherlock Holmes many years later, we used that exact same bar, but just flipped it from a Western to an English pub. So that's the way they did it. Every time they built a big scene, okay, we can invest this much on this particular scene, this setting, and then we'll just save it. But the rest of it, we'll have to repurpose what we already have, because people just don't realize how expensive it is. I mean, they're drawing VeggieTales, obviously, no arms, no legs. How hard could it be? Well, you got to put costumes on, and you have to put them in an environment, and that environment takes a long time to build, which means hours of the day from a lot of different artists. So just having fun with Mike Naraki. He pitched a couple lines that eventually we used, and he was having fun with it. Everybody was having a good time, but I don't remember any angst or anger over, oh, they cut that. Man, oh man, that was my best work. No, it's the way it is. You've got to service the story and the emotion of Joseph at the end praying. It's like, okay, they hit that beat. That really worked. And some other things like, you know what? You throw a lot of gags up against the wall. Not everything sticks, and sometimes we got to cut it. So that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, some of the more interesting parts of the episode that did get cut, they put as little Easter eggs in the DVD menus. The song that Madame Blueberry sings, "I Am So Blue," not to be confused with the song she sang on her debut episode, "I'm So Blue," but they did cut, I believe it was like 1 or 2 additional lines of her song. A little bit later, in the scene where the mayor is freaking out about his dream, there was an extended gag of like more people trying to interpret the mayor's dream. That, again, I'm assuming that they wanted to keep the episode really snappy, so they cut it out, which, I found to be pretty interesting. As someone who has seen The Ballad of Little Joe, countless amount of times throughout the years, the episode has such a very snappy pace, and it almost feels like, one joke after another, after another, after another, and after you talking about how you are very much a comedian and doing stand-up, it almost makes sense in that regard, that it just hits you with one laugh after the other after the other. And I also have to say that it's probably, in my personal opinion, one of the funniest episodes of VeggieTales. But the humor doesn't come at a cost of the story, because the story of Little Joe still hits those emotional beats. The message is about faith and keeping your faith with God when times are really tough. So, I have to applaud you for your work on that. And also, the fandom absolutely goes crazy over that episode. So I don't know if it exactly sold well. If it did, and if it didn't, I would still have to say that you did a great job on writing that episode, Battle of Little Joe. So just give yourself a little pat on the back if you could.
Well, I will float on cloud nine for the rest of the day. Thank you. I appreciate it. You talked about childhood as far as everything going into the blender. Well, when I grew up, Westerns were huge on TV. And so I was a big fan of Bonanza. Well, something that you can't relate to because you were 3 when it came out. Well, when I was a kid, I watched Bonanza, probably about the same age as you were. And those episodes of Bonanza, the Western family, stuck with me, and they had a character named Hop Sing. And so I said, well, let's make jokes for the adults along with the kids. And so there's a little servant there that's all. It was supposed to be every time he took a hop, he would sing. I said, only 6 people are going to get this joke. They were old enough to remember Bonanza, but it makes me laugh. And so that's what I mean about throwing gags up against the wall. You just here's something for the kids. This is a funny pratfall. Okay, counting sheep. Okay, here's one for the adults. Okay, here's one, and you just keep doing it. And when you talk about the dreams that didn't make it to the final cut, that's just an opportunity. Every comedian, if you're worth your salt, you say, okay, how can I comparison contrast, and how can I go down some funny roads? Well, how would somebody else interpret a dream? There's room for comedy there, and so you write it. And if it doesn't make the final cut, again, that's perfectly okay. But the comedic mind is always going down these paths going, how can this be funny? What can be funny here? What can I do here? Oh, that'll be funny. So there's a lot in there that comes from the blender of my own life, and I appreciate. And I think even Phil Vischer said that was one of his favorite episodes. So I do appreciate the kudos on that.
Also, to go back to the whole Western thing, I remember that in the commentary, they specifically said that they added little nudges and little references to other Westerns at the time. And one of my favorites is that shot where Little Joe is seeing his family after so many years. And it goes to this very Clint Eastwood kind of showdown part where it flashes between Larry's perspective and then the P's moving into frame, which is another excellent stroke of genius. And I don't know whoever came up with that little gag, but absolutely hilarious and nailed the Western. Absolutely nailed the spaghetti Western feeling.
I wrote in there close up of the eyes. That was very Clint Eastwood. And so I had to have, the squinty eyes and the tension builds. And then, so it's like, yeah, it's a Western. What are we going to do here? So we had a lot of fun with that.
We have Battle of Little Joe, and your name was Bob Lee, or at least that's what they credited you as. Is there a story behind the credited Bob Lee? Because I have my own theory, but if you have an explanation for it, way better than mine.
The explanation is very simple, and that is they never asked me what I wanted to have my name, how it was like. Professionally, it has to be Robert G. Lee and all the unions and everything else. But the guy from church, who was the head of VeggieTales at that time, be from church. And at church, I'm Bob. I'm just, hey, Bob, how you doing? So it's just a very casual name. And some of my close friends call me Bobby. And so, but professionally, it's always Robert G. Lee. So it was purely Bob Lee because that's what the executive producer, that's how he knew me. He goes, well, it's written by Bob Lee. It's like, okay. And so that's what they put. And from then on, I said, you guys might want to change it to Robert G. Lee if at all possible. So
my theory was that, with your name being Robert G. Lee, some people would be like, wait, is he related to the Civil War person? That makes a lot more sense.
We don't want to offend. Yeah, that was before people got offended by that.
But going back to originally what I was said, Battle of Little Joe came out in 2003. And then it wouldn't be a couple of years before we saw your name at the end of a VeggieTales credit. So it seemed that you were kind of off and on with your relationship with VeggieTales, where you wrote an episode, probably saw it through a majority of its production just to make sure that, everything was good. And then you kind of took a gap. You came back a bit, wrote some other scripts and did some other things, took another gap, and then came back and did some little things before eventually you left the show. So was there any particular reason as to why production or your involvement with the show is very on and off?
And the best way I can describe that is one word, and that's called bankruptcy. VeggieTales went through several bankruptcies, and when they did, all production stopped. And they fired people, they got rid of people, and they would reformulate. Somebody else would come in and buy it, and they would start up again, and they hired the same people. So David Hibbs and different people came back, and they brought me back on, and we would write some more, and then they'd go bankrupt again. And then there was a long pause, and eventually it got to the point where next iteration that happened, everybody was gone. And so I didn't have any contacts there, and so they stopped hiring me because it was all new people who found different people to work for them. So there's a sadness to that, in that These happened, and it kept the character of VeggieTales for a long time, and then it started to change. It's just really difficult. Every time they did a movie, it wouldn't make money, and all these they would try to. I mean, this is the backstory of trying. And Phil Vischer talks about this in his book, if I'm not mistaken, that he claims a big mea culpa, and he realizes the hubris of trying to do more than he could. He overreached, and a lot of people lost their livelihood and their jobs, and it was just very sad that this happened. It was such a great idea, and the hubris is Phil wanted it to be Disney, and Disney expanded and expanded. But if you read the story of Disney, I mean, he made it by the skin of his teeth. The Disneyland was called Disney's Folly, and he was going to lose everything with Snow White, but he happened to come out on the other side. You have marketing of a new generation, and I remember when the Pirates Who Don't Do Anything came out, and it didn't do any money in the North. It just completely tanked, and it made money in the South. But the Chipmunks movie came out. That was in 3D at the same time, and it made $20 million in a weekend, and VeggieTales made less than one. It was like, oh, it's just the marketing and the way the world is. So the viewers didn't need or want movies. They wanted the videos. They wanted a TV show, and VeggieTales kept reaching, trying to do movies, and they never quite worked. You can think what you want about Jonah, but it didn't work. It just didn't work as a story. There was two different stories going on, and they kept cutting back and forth, and it was crazy hijinks, and it'd go back to Jonah, but it wouldn't fit the entire movie, so they added things to stretch it out, and the audience rejected it, basically, so they didn't make any money on it. And so we kept supporting VeggieTales, trying to do these half-hour and full-hour videos with the silly songs and everything else, and those made money, and those could be done reasonably. Unfortunately, movies kept bringing the whole company down, and that's why there are huge gaps or long gaps between what I did for them, because nobody was working for them.
That's very interesting that you brought up the Jonah movie, because I remember when studying the information about the history of the movie, how originally it was supposed to be a 45-minute little episode, which back in the 90s when 30 minutes was the norm, seeing a 45-minute film was going to be a lot more ambitious and a lot more achieving than just typical 30-minute stuff. But what happened was, when Phil Vischer was shopping the idea around to the studio, they kept adding more ideas, especially with Mike Naraki's little road trip bits between Bob and the Veggie Kids and whatnot. And it was the want to have Jonah, but also have that backdrop that basically morphed the movie into getting the theatrical runtime. And because it's theatrical now, the budgeted double, and it didn't work out, especially when they had the lawsuits and the eventual bankruptcy. During the production of Jonah, they were very much in the red, and during several times they didn't know whether it was going to come out. And in my personal opinion, I didn't think that Jonah was all that good of a movie, so it seems rather interesting that we kind of hold, in a way, the same opinion on Jonah. Personally, I didn't think it was all that good, wasn't all that great, but sometimes that's just what happens, especially with what you mentioned, trying to, with all the hubris and trying to be Walt Disney. Bring it back to about you. I believe your next credit would be with the episode Duke and the Great Pie War that originally was under the name of Princess and the Pie War, and you wrote the Babysitter in Denial story. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Can you tell me what was it like writing that particular story, if you have any recollections of it?
Other than I like the pun of denial, and I thought it was okay, this is going to be a fun story. And we had the sets. I mean, that was one of the things, like, okay, we have an Egyptian set. What can you do with an Egyptian set? Well, I could do Moses. Fantastic. Great. Let's do Moses as a child. So the thing with VeggieTales is they had already explored a lot of stories. They'd already gone for a lot of the basics. So we were kind of going around digging through saying, well, how about a story about this? Well, we haven't done this one yet. How could we attack this? And Moses is so big. And how do you do Moses as an older story? You can do it, but good grief, he's murdered somebody, then he's alone for 40 years as a sheep herder. How are you going to tell that story? Well, let's do Moses as a young boy. And I can remember back in college, we did Jesus as a young boy. We had one of our radio shows as the early days of Jesus. And so that kind of launched the early days of Moses. So I wanted to do something about his mom and, just the danger of being in denial, being, it was a horrible thing. They were killing all the Jewish babies. So how do you get this story? And that's kind of where it came from. And of course, they also had the peas. Hey, peas are cute. That'll be great. Let's do that. We have the set. We've got peas. We got the story of Moses. Let's go. And so it was just a short little, again, it wasn't the full, Indiana Cuke was the big, satire of Indiana Jones, but they always needed to have short little things in between. So yeah, they came to me for that one.
It came from like trying to originally do the Scope of Moses, like, Prince of Egypt, which is a phenomenal film. And then it's like, wait, we can't necessarily do that because we have the Duke and the Great Pie War story, which was based on Naomi and Ruth. And, we want that to be the central focus. We need to shrink it down and make it smaller. So it was interesting how you were able to shrink the idea down and still was able to deliver something that the big idea people definitely really enjoyed. To kind of dissect the story a little bit, I thought that it was interesting that, not to say that it hadn't like no jokes or anything like that, because there definitely was a couple of gags, but it felt like in comparison to Little Joe, where that was a lot of gags, having the heartfelt moments every here and there, it felt like this story was kind of leaning a little bit more on the drama, a little bit more on the serious side of things. Do you have like anything to really say about that?
You're absolutely correct. You just have to realize the subject matter, things are wide open for parody and satire and pratfalls. The story of, if our baby cries, he will be killed. And that was also the nature of the beast. It's like, this could be a more serious one. It's like, okay, good, let's do that, because you want to involve people emotionally, and losing your child is not something that is going to be funny. It's just, you just can't do it. And so you have to respect. I'm not talking about respecting it for VeggieTales. I'm talking about people's faith. You can go, waka, waka, waka. Hey, Moses could be killed any moment now. You just can't do that. So you have to come up with danger and then tell the story of, wait a minute, I've got an idea. And will this idea work? So yeah, it's a different kind of story. Whereas Joseph had the low beats when he's in prison, thrown aside by his brothers. But before that, you can just pack that, because it's not as reverent. And that's why I always tell people with the story about Jesus, you have to be completely reverent. You can mock things around him. This is what Monty Python did with The Life of Brian. They did it irreverently, and Ben-Hur did it reverently. But you can't ever make fun of Jesus in a film or in a movie. And a lot of people don't get that. A lot of comics go, oh, I thought you could do those jokes. Like, no, you can't. You have to be reverent. And so that's what it was with Moses. It is an inherently dramatic story. So you're absolutely right.
That's a great way of putting at it. Because I remember on a separate podcast where you were talking about a recent experience where you were watching the new Doctor Strange movie and comparing that to how you were viewing Minions Rise of Gru movie, and just how you could pretty much tell that the movies were lacking something. And you mentioned how the Minions movie was missing that emotional aspect, and how it was just joke after joke after joke, but there's no heart. There's no reason to care about the characters. So it really puts to imagine that, you're not just this one-dimensional, okay, he's the gag guy, just he's good at the chuckles and the yucks at the audience. He can write something seriously because he can take something, add some jokes, but still not overly stuff it. I find that breakdown very valuable for any possible future writers who are trying to balance some sacred elements with some humor, and knowing what stuff you can riff on, the stuff that you shouldn't riff on, what stuff to take seriously, some stuff to poke gags at. Great gems of knowledge that you're dropping on me right now, which is really inspirational. But now we're going to jump a year. No, actually, no, I'm sorry. This was released the same year, Minnesota Cuke, Samson's Hairbrush, and you wrote, I believe, the Bully Trouble story. Is that correct?
Wait a minute. Remind me of that one. Who was in that one?
Which one? The Cuke story or the Bully Trouble one?
Was that Junior?
Yeah, that was the one with Junior dealing with the bully and retreating to his playhouse.
That one came from, we wanted to do a Walter Mitty. If you know that story, I forget the original author, but Walter Mitty was there, and every time he got in trouble, he would go off into his imagination. We said, wouldn't it be fun for Junior to he's in a sandbox, and what kind of things could he come up with? And it was kind of inspired by Calvin and Hobbes, to be honest. If you ever read Calvin and Hobbes, he would always be this spaceman spiff and go off, and his parents would always wonder why he's off in his imagination. We said, well, we could do that with Junior. And so we had to have a story that Junior had to escape from, and that was the bully. But he just kept, by going into his imagination time and time and time again, hopefully he would find a way to gain courage to stand up to a bully. And so that's the genesis of it. It came from a lot of imagination and Calvin and Hobbes, and we put that all together into the again, another short, not so much an interstitial, but a short in the middle of you got the main VeggieTales story, and then you've got the Hairbrush song or whatever you have for Mike and Rocky, and then another short, and then you go back to the main story.
That explains a lot of things, because usually with VeggieTales stories, you could kind of pin what the writers or the directors were trying to like get at. With Minnesota Cuke, you get Indiana Jones, Duke and the Great Pine War. That was a prequel to King George and the Ducky, which originated as the Dave and Bathsheba story. Junior's Bully Trouble, you have elements of like Robin Hood, and then you also have him with his dream world, his escapism. So it's really interesting to see where the origins of those ideas came from. Did you by any chance write the song that Junior had where he was in the forest with his band of merry men? Have any idea where the Robin Hood theme came from, or was that something that was added later in production?
I don't remember that. That was 20 some years ago, and I'd have to go back. If there was a song in it, it was generally me, but I don't remember that one. I really don't. I apologize.
No, it's okay.
I'm no good to you here.
No, that is definitely not true. It's okay. So then I believe the next story that you wrote, which actually was a year after Minnesota Q came out, we go to 2006 with Sherlock Holmes and the Golden Ruler. Now, the one thing that always puzzled me was that in the credits, you were credited as the sole writer of the episode. So did you write both the Asparagus of La Mancha story and the Sherlock story, or was it that maybe you only worked on one story, but I don't know, I guess they decided to credit you for both?
And the Sherlock one I thought really worked, and the Asparagus one, I could never conquer it. It just didn't work for me. Tried and tried and tried, but Man of La Mancha, we're trying to adapt Man of La Mancha and just couldn't get a handle on the funny on that one. So it both how it was directed, which in my opinion wasn't great, and I'm sorry that's critical, but also the writing. But I loved the Sherlock Holmes. We had so much fun on that one. So it's funny how in one video I had my high and my low. It's like I feel like Man of La Mancha, it was the one that's like just couldn't conquer it. I've tried so many different ways to make it work. So yeah, that was the one. That's my bad penny as far as I'm concerned at VeggieTales. And but the Sherlock Holmes, no, I wrote both of them, wrote the songs, and that was again the set that we repurposed from Little Joe from years earlier, and it was just fun to play with the Golden Ruler and to see what message and moral we could get in there. And I also have one of my infamous jokes. People always ask me, well, did anything get cut from VeggieTales? And I do have one of those stories on that particular episode.
Yeah, just real quick, it was the infamously cut joke of referencing that Sherlock Holmes had a cocaine addiction, and then you wanted to just poke fun at that with having Larry get addicted to it. I guess I shouldn't be explaining it because it was your joke, so feel free to describe the joke. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overstep my boundaries.
You heard that on the podcast more, but they didn't put that in the liner notes or anything, did they?
That was straight from the podcast feed. It was in the 8-minute mark. I remember my friends were asking me about that. I was like, all right, let me go find it. And it was right there, 8 minutes in.
Yeah, so that was, we're always making jokes for the adults, for the parents in the room. And it's like, all right, these are things, this is something no kid's going to get. But it crossed the line of standards and practices. And they said, we don't want any kid imitating this. So yes, if you read Conan Doyle's story of Sherlock Holmes, he was a cocaine addict, and this was done in the early 1900s, and cocaine was legal at that time. And he played violin, and he snorted a lot of coke. And it was one of those, when you read it, you go, oh, I didn't realize that. It's kind of eye-opening. Well, so we're adapting Sherlock Holmes. I said, well, I got to put that in someplace. So I had Larry with a bottle of Coke, floating as if he's holding it with a straw, and the straw goes up his nose, and he snorts it up, and bubbles come out of his ears, and he just looks at the camera and goes, I don't get this at all. And for some unknown reason, they cut that joke. They didn't like that one, and they laughed at it. They all thought it was pretty doggone funny, but they said, oh, we can't do that one, Bob. So, come on, no kid's ever gonna get it. Go, well, what if some kid imitates it, puts a straw up his nose? They go, all right, you won. We can cut it.
Wow. I mean, I remember sometime after that podcast came out, like a fan of the show did his own interpretation of the joke. He didn't animate it, but he rendered a couple of pictures. So if at some point I'm able to find, I'll definitely send it your way. But yeah, it's interesting because if veggie animators get any whiff of like a song that was scrapped or a segment that got cut or a joke, there are bound to be replicas or people trying to do their own version of like, what if the joke was in the show? So congratulations, the scrapped cocaine joke was referenced in the fandom. So I bet that's like the biggest compliment you've heard this entire day.
That's great. That's wonderful.
So the Sherlock story, when exactly did you read the stories? Or did you have something like, say, possibly Great Mouse Detective, like to sort of get you into it? Or was it just you already had a fascination for the source material?
I always loved Sherlock Holmes, and it was totally Sherlock Holmes. No, the Great Mouse Detective, I thought was one of the weaker efforts from Disney. That didn't do much for me. It was definitely Sherlock Holmes. It's like, how can we adapt this classic story? And of course, but doing it the Larry way, which is bumbling into it's a little bit of Inspector Clouseau, along with that. You combine Inspector Clouseau and Sherlock Holmes, and you end up with that VeggieTale. There are always other influences, obviously, but the mystery can't be that great. And it had to be, what's really underneath this is it's really a story of crime. The crime isn't the important thing. What's important is how we treat one another. And Larry's taking all the credit and Bob is kind of getting pushed out. And then it became an interesting story to us.
I personally enjoyed the Sherlock story way more than La Mancha, and even revisiting that episode, it's kind of weird how I'm kind of mixed on La Mancha even nowadays, because that episode actually did scare me when I was a kid. There was a scene where in one of the dreams, Archibald gets chased by this big giant monster version of the food factory, and absolutely scared the piss out of me when I was a kid. But I find it interesting that you say that La Mancha was one of your weaker efforts, one of your weaker works. Was it because maybe you didn't have an attachment to the source material, or was it that when you were just trying to write and come up for ideas for that segment, nothing was hitting the mark?
I think it's both, but it always comes back to the source material in this case, and that is read Man of La Mancha, tried to decipher. It's like, you know what? It's just a guy tilting at windmills, really, and there's nothing you can get a hold of it. The story is just him and dream sequences and wishing. And I said, how did this ever make it into a popular story? I don't like any part of this. I think love of Sherlock Holmes was a great contrast to what you're talking about with Man of La Mancha. And if you don't love the story, there's nothing I could do to make it work because it's not a good story. It's not like, yes, he's overcoming to become a hero, or he's finding a way to beat the bully. It's like, no, it's just a bunch of dream sequences and he's tilting windmills and nothing really happens. So I will take blame for it, but not 100% blame, because it's just not a good story. We should have just revised the story and made it into a real goal instead of what we ended up with. So yeah, and I just thought it was flat. I just thought nothing really landed. That's why I point my way. I think, that could have been directed differently. That should have been tighter. That could have been better. So I was highly critical of that, from my writing to the direction. And yeah, again, don't think it worked on a lot of levels.
I think we could pretty much say that out of all the things that you worked at Big Idea, La Mancha was the biggest one that you regret or wish that you could change. Would that be a fair assessment to say?
Yes.
The original concept of Asparagus of La Mancha was going to be completely different. According to the commentary, the original idea was a Bob and Larry space adventure. Apparently what happened was Disney released Treasure Planet, and for some reason that led Big Idea to getting cold feet, and eventually that story turned into Asparagus of La Mancha. Would you happen to have any recollection of that sort of thing, or possibly was that like out of your hands, that they were like, okay, here, have La Mancha and go off and do something with it?
It was definitely the latter of the two. I was not involved in the space adventure at all. That would have been so much better. That would have been so much fun. No, I was not included in that original discussion. Now I feel ripped off again. Now I'm mad at Mike. My gosh, I was everywhere.
It's funny because years later, this was after your involvement with the show, in 2014, they released Veggie Fennel Frontier, which is very much that Bob and Larry space adventure, an episode that I actually quite enjoy a lot. So maybe in some way that idea kind of resurfaced. But in my opinion, yeah, the Bob and Larry space adventure would have been so much better than La Mancha, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Then, after Sherlock Holmes, in the same year, 2006, Gideon Tuba Warrior, which I have to say is probably one of the most underrated, underappreciated episodes. Because, I mean, Gideon, to me, is like, you kind of came back to that similar writing style of Little Joe, where jokes after jokes after jokes, like sort of like endless riffing material, whereas get a little bit more emotionally immature with the story of Babysitter in Denial and Bully Trouble. You kind of go back into just having some fun, just absolute parody craziness, and probably one of the funnier episodes of VeggieTales nowadays. Can you explain where that idea came from of, hey, I want to tackle Gideon and maybe some of the origins of the jokes and that sort of thing?
Well, I totally agree with you, and that was that. If I would say what is my style, I always point to Gideon, Sherlock, and Little Joe, and those are just like, okay, I feel like that was me. So I really like the story of Gideon. First off, I love the story of Gideon. It's just a great story of he's a coward and he rises above his station, and look what God can do. And I just loved all the twists and turns, and nope, that's too many of your people and they got to get rid of them. And so how are we going to show that? And then the fleece, there's so many things in there. I wanted to have a dream sequence, and I wanted to have it a little bit different than what they normally did. And so they used cutouts, and I was writing it. It was very interesting.
But particularly funny little stories about how several jokes came into play, or perhaps how you came up with the genius song that is The Great I Am, which absolutely phenomenal VeggieTale song.
Well, that's my favorite. I love the I Am song. I love songwriting and I love lyrics, and it's just so much fun when you find one that, okay, this one works. And I didn't sing that one. Kurt did the music that to him by himself. So I don't even think as I said, a lot of earlier times I would send my version of it, and he just took it and ran with it. And I thought it turned out great. So I love that song. So that was just one of those little moments where you're sitting in front of the typewriter and you go, I want to write this and talk about God being bigger, and how do you show that? And so it's like, well, he's the great I am, let's go with it. So that just kind of flowed out. I must admit, I love that song.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, I always laughed at the part where the cutouts of several prophets, and then Billy Graham is mentioned. That one always made me laugh. And just a little bit about myself. I remember after watching that episode, I started like kind of singing that song a little bit and always laughing at Billy Graham. And then my mom comes into the room and she says, "Hey, don't you dare laugh about Billy Graham," and something like that. So it's a very interesting little memory that I have. That on top of all these people's names, I don't remember who specifically the song's name. You don't mess with Billy Graham. You don't mess with him. Rest in peace, by the way.
Crossed the line there. I'm sorry. Please apologize to your mother for me.
No, it was because I was mocking. I was kind of like, singing, humming along, and being like, "Oh, Billy Graham's a funny name," because I never heard of him up until that point. So you weren't at fault. It was my thing to sort of keep the pace going. In 2008, Tomato Sawyer, Huckleberry Larry came out, and apparently you did some additional writing. So I'm assuming that there isn't really too much to discuss besides if you remember what this additional writing was.
Well, that was one of the fun things of VeggieTales, that they would bring in me as a script doctor every once in a while. I did it for the TV show, and I would have to rewrite things. And it's like, well, we have this, but it's not quite working. And how can you punch this up? And what would you think? And so then I would go through and try and find gags, find better ways to do things. That they did that on that script, and then they brought somebody in to help the Christmas episode that I started off, and then somebody else finished. Because I was doing things that weren't in public domain, and they switched it to public domain. So there was a lot of that going on, where they would say, well, let's send it over to Robert, let's send it over to this person, and see if we can get some punch up. So that's what happens in the sitcom room, and that's what happened on that particular episode. But no, I don't remember which jokes I punched. If I watched it, I could say that was mine, but right now I can't.
All right, that's good to know. And because I find it interesting, that episode, I believe they say that the main writer was Phil Vischer, but then in the credits it's like, you weren't the only additional writer. There was like a whole, probably like 5 or 6 other names in there, which I found to be really interesting, because I don't think there was any other episode of VeggieTales that had that many assistant writers. So I guess, I don't know, I guess they really did need help on that particular script to kind of make it more in line with how VeggieTales was. But that's just my guess. I don't know if you have anything to say.
My guess would be probably Phil's working on another film, and so he had to drop the script and say, you guys just, and the director's saying, well, this needs some help here, here, and here. So they sent it out to 5 different people. We all pitched in, and they conglomerated some kind of Frankenstein script out of it. But I suspect he was, he had 1,000 irons and 1,000 fires, that whether it was a film or the business dealings or whatever it is, he couldn't spend enough time on it. So that's probably why they sent it out.
That actually does add up, because he was in production with the Pirates movie, which he also wrote, and I believe he directed. So yeah, there you go. We're going to go into the Christmas episode, which is the St. Nicholas story. And I find it interesting. You were writing it along with Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki, and you brought up the part where you wanted to do some silly little Christmas jingle parodies, but then they had to be public domain. Do you remember if there was, besides that, like any other big script changes or story changes or anything like that for that episode?
That was a really tough one to get through. First, I'll address the jingles. So I started off, and I was using parodies of sitcoms. and they were very funny, but it's like, oh, it just isn't working because we can't get the rights to all this. So then they changed it to, I thought it was brilliant. They changed it to Christmas. And I said, why am I such a moron? I didn't figure that one out. Finding that line, they would read long letters from parents about, you can't steal my kid's innocence. Don't you dare do this. And what are we talking about? And is Santa Claus, and it's not about Christmas. And Christmas is about Jesus. It's not Santa Claus. So we had to really tiptoe around a lot of stuff. And that was a tough one to crack, because every time we do a version, they'd come back with, no, these parents don't like this, and this is going to go against standards and practices, and we know our audience, and we can't do this. Like, oh, okay, all right, how about this? But they said, but we want to do a Christmas story. Okay. That was one where at a certain point, all right, you know what? I can't do it. So they gave it to another writer. He came up with the idea of the Christmas song jingles as switching out the one I originally had. I had all these ideas about, we'll do a Greek chorus and that'll be fun, like Little Shop of Horrors, and we'll do this and we'll do that. But we kept running up against the main issue, which was, how far do we show Santa Claus, and does it hurt Christianity, and does it hurt all these parents who are keeping their kids in an idealistic bubble? And it was something that it was a tough needle to thread.
Well, I would have to say that those efforts were definitely for the better, because I would say that around the time that the episode came out, it was definitely one of the better ones. And I don't know if you exactly know this, but in the VeggieTales fandom, people say that VeggieTales went through a dark period where the show wasn't itself anymore, and it felt really dumbed down, and it was bad. Before the Netflix reboot came in, fans typically will say that VeggieTales died after the year 2010. And that St. Nicholas episode was the very last one to be released before this, what we call the slew of dark, bad episodes. So good job just kind of getting out before stuff collectively hit the fan.
And that was, again, the episode you're talking about, that's when they fired everybody that used to work for VeggieTales, and they brought in a whole new crew. And we didn't know anybody, and they didn't know the VeggieTales history. And so it was like, it's all new people learn, and you're going to make mistakes. You clear house, bring in all new people. There'll be a change in the personality of whatever you're doing. And that's what happened with VeggieTales.
With the Pirates movie being such a giant financial bomb for Big Idea, I believe that I was reading some of Phil Vischer's, he was on his website, he did some blogging in 2008, and he was particularly talking about, pray for Big Idea, pray for Mike Naraki, because they're going to have a really rough Christmas holiday. And it always led me to question, if Big Idea nearly died around their 15th anniversary at that time as well, how did they get back up to produce the later episodes after the Pirates movie and after Huckleberry Larry? Would you happen to have any insight on that, or is it just, I don't know, I guess that's out of your hands?
Well, it was out of my hands because I wasn't involved with it, but I think at that point it was DreamWorks came in and bought them. It was just like somebody said, "This is a great idea, and we're not going to do movies, but it's viable as a video. Parents still want to buy them for their kids. Let's resurrect this." And so company after company after company came in and tried to rewrite it or fix it, and eventually it's the point where now even Phil was cut out this last go around. But it's all just people thinking, well, it's too bad that it didn't run the way it should have been run, and we can do it better. And then, as I said, DreamWorks was the first one, and that was right around that time. And then there were other groups bought it after that. TBN tried it for a while. There's a lot of groups that have tried it, and as I said, this last time, Phil said, "I would like to be more involved," and they eventually they cut him out entirely. So he has no say whatsoever in the latest VeggieTales. So there's just stories tinged with sadness, unfortunately.
Yeah. Also, not to be that guy, but to correct your history a little bit, DreamWorks didn't enter the picture until 2012. The time that Big Idea was almost on death's row was around 2008 and 2009. Just again, not trying to be a smart aleck, but
No, you know it a lot better. My memories are muddy. I'm like, well, I'm not working on it. Whatever. Okay.
Quickly, just to wrap this up, question about some additional work you did at Big Idea. You were credited apparently for writing a couple episodes of the 321 Penguins show, and you also did some of the VeggieTales on TV stuff. Can you explain a little bit how that came to be?
Yeah, the 321 Penguins was so much fun to write. You had the big Kevin, who was the big dumb bird, and you had these penguins going off doing adventures, and they go to different planets, and you get to make up stuff. So that was just so much fun. They tried to launch that as a recurring, Saturday morning kind of cartoon. that was a blast. And I still get residuals from that every once in a while from the Writers Guild. It's hilarious. It's been so many years, but that was just a lot of fun. And it was an offshoot of the creative people from VeggieTales. So they formed their own company and they started working on that. And then when they reformatted VeggieTales into the TV format, they had to find ways to get in and out of the episodes because you've got commercials, you've got breaks, you have different things. And so they needed writers to, okay, let's take these three disparate songs or videos and see if we can find a theme and then do a desktop and give a lesson. And yeah, those are fun things to do as well. So all of that, I just so thoroughly enjoy because it's you at a typewriter in your imagination, trying to bring things together and be funny and be touching and make a point and do it within a minute and 5 seconds, because the TV is very tight on time. All that, a total pleasure. I enjoyed that phase of my career, and you will not hear me complain about it. There's always difficulties when that script didn't turn out as well as I wanted, or that wasn't directed the way I wanted. But for the most part, when you look back and you hear reactions of people like you, it's like, you know what? I was lucky to be at the right place at the right time and write these. I wish Penguins would have continued. It wasn't a big hit and it didn't get a lot of play anywhere, but it was so much fun.
And the next thing I want to ask is sort of that post VeggieTales career. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time to ask you questions about, literally every single project you were involved with, but just sort of a brief summary of what was the stuff that you were doing moving off with VeggieTales. What projects were you getting into?
All this started with VeggieTales because people saw what I was doing at our church drama group, and enough people came up and said, we want to see you take this group of ragtag professionals and make a movie. Let's go bigger. Let's see if we can conquer the Christian market. So we found a church that was empty and abandoned, and we wrote a movie. I wrote a movie around it, and it's called Can I Get a Witness Protection? And that came out like 15 or 16. And that was just using all the people, some of the most talented people I know of, that we wrote a story, and it pretty much echoed Sister Act or Some Like It Hot, where a guy sees a gangland murder and they hide him in a church, and he's the very first weekend there, the head pastor dies, and a guy who knows nothing about religion becomes the head pastor. So that's the plot of Can I Get a Witness Protection? Had a lot of fun, loved it, but it's just really hard to break into as Phil and everybody else in VeggieTales knows, it's hard to break into the movie theater. So it wasn't released on film, it was released on video. We've got a lot of great reviews, but it didn't catch the world on fire. So you say, okay, my next big project was a book, and I had so much fun doing it. I always thought that everybody's always making fun of Christianity. So I said, there's got to be an intersection between science and faith. A book called What's the Big Idea? A comedian explains God, the universe, and other minor stuff. I went through a stack of science books, had a blast doing it. Took about 2 years to really do a lot of research. And I just showed that cumulative effect of all these miraculous happenings of how our universe was created and our world and our bodies. It's an inescapable conclusion that it would be impossible for all this to happen by random chance. And that's what that book was about. I love doing it. That came out about a year and a half ago. So when I go on the road, I sell copies at my back table. Right now, the TV warm-up has gone away because of COVID. They weren't allowed to shoot with audiences anymore. And a lot of the 3-camera work is done. So my career, it's always morphing. And as a friend of mine from film school once said, you ride the horse that's running. So back into stand-up comedy full-time. I've got a dry bar special that came out. I'm getting ready to record my next video before COVID came out in September. And I can close with this story for you on just how God works. I gave my latest recording of my comedy to Sirius Radio. They'd played me. It's always a lot of fun. They have Laugh USA and they like clean comedy. Well, I submitted it in September. Took them a long time, took them 7 months to finally get it on the air. Well, COVID hit and I started getting residuals in April. So it happened in March. And then by April, I was making a third of my income from radio residuals. I didn't know it was going to happen, but I always tell everybody, God knew it was going to happen. And he made sure that I was able to survive the last 2 years because of radio residuals from Sirius Radio. So I'm working on my next album. I'll record that in the next 6 months or so and put that on Sirius. And it's kind of nice. I've been heard over 500,000 times on Sirius Radio. So it feels like that's the direction my life is going. I don't see a lot of animated films. I don't see a lot of Christian comedies come out. They had I've had a couple, but nothing's really broken through. I think they're still very skittish on what's going to happen. So I don't know if I'll ever make another movie. I love scripts more than anything, but I'm working on stand-up because that's the horse that's running.
That is truly amazing. And, you know, it sucks that, unfortunately, with the time being, I wasn't able to get into more of the non-VeggieTale stuff. But, you know, if you're willing to try to set up a time for a part two, I would love to get into that, because I was listening to some of your stand-up comedy routines, and you got some great material and such like that. I mean, I love the C ends with oscopy
Yeah.
whole bit. That one was absolutely hilarious. Thanks again for taking your time out of your busy schedule, because you are a man of many things. And I bid you farewell and good luck to all of your ventures.
I'll be glad to talk to you again. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, have a good day, and thanks for answering all my questions.
That wraps up my amazing conversation with Robert G. Lee. I'd like to give a very special thanks to Robert for allowing me the privilege of talking to him for such an extended period of time. You can find Robert on his YouTube page by searching for his name, followed by the @RobertGLee, your daily dose tag. All one word, by the way. No spaces included. You can also find him on his website at robertglee.com. Special thanks for Mr. Lunch for the additional research, and until the next interview, we'll be seeing you guys for the next What's the Big Idea podcast.